November 3rd, 2025. 50 Ukrainian drones, each worth $300, were about to do something that military analysts said was mathematically impossible. But when that $300 swarm tore through Russia's $50 million Pantsir-S1 air defense system in under 2 minutes, it didn't just destroy cutting-edge technology, it proved that warfare had fundamentally changed forever. The morning of November 3rd, 2025, started like any other day at the Russian air defense installation near Mariupol. 27 Russian operators monitored their screens inside a reinforced concrete bunker, watching over the most advanced short-range air defense system Russia had deployed in occupied Ukraine. The Pantsir-S1 system, sitting outside, represented $50 million of engineering, designed to track and destroy everything from cruise missiles traveling at supersonic speeds to small drones moving at barely 60 kilometers per hour. Its dual 30mm autocannons could fire 4,000 rounds per minute, while its 12 surface-to-air missiles could engage targets up to 20 kilometers away. Russian military doctrine considered this system nearly impenetrable, a technological fortress that could protect critical infrastructure from virtually any aerial threat. What those operators did not know was that 80 kilometers away, 3 Ukrainian drone pilots were about to challenge every assumption that expensive weapons system was built upon. The Ukrainian operation had been planned for 3 weeks, but its conceptual foundation went back months earlier. Ukrainian military engineers had been studying a critical vulnerability in Russian air defense systems, not a flaw in the radar or the weapons themselves, but in the fundamental logic of how these systems prioritize threats. The Pantsir-S1 had been designed during an era when aerial threats were expensive, sophisticated weapons, cruise missiles costing millions of dollars, fighter jets worth tens of millions, strategic bombers representing hundreds of millions in investment. The system's artificial intelligence had been programmed to identify the most dangerous threats first, engaging the fastest-moving or largest targets before dealing with smaller, slower contacts. This made perfect tactical sense when every aerial threat represented a significant investment and carried devastating firepower. But Ukrainian engineers realized that this logic created an exploitable weakness. If you could overwhelm the system with dozens of cheap, expendable targets simultaneously, you could force it to make impossible choices. In those moments of computational hesitation, you could slip through its defenses. The 50 drones Ukraine assembled for this operation cost $300 each. They were built from commercial parts, carbon fiber frames from Chinese manufacturers, motors designed for racing drones, flight controllers that gamers used for simulators, and first-person view cameras that hobbyists mounted on recreational aircraft. The total cost for all 50 drones, including batteries, antennas, and control systems, came to $15,000. Each drone carried a 1-kilogram-shaped charge, enough explosive to damage but not destroy the Pantsir system's radar or weapon systems. But damage was all they needed. The operation was not designed to obliterate the $50 million installation in a single devastating strike. Instead, it aimed to do something far more psychologically damaging, prove that expensive, sophisticated technology could be neutralized by cheap, numerous, coordinated attacks that cost less than a used pickup truck. At 6:45 in the morning local time, the 3 Ukrainian operators initiated the launch sequence. They were positioned in a fortified basement 80 kilometers from the target, a distance that kept them safely beyond the range of Russian counter-battery fire and gave them the freedom to operate without fear of immediate retaliation. Each operator controlled a swarm of drones through a tablet interface that looked deceptively simple. a map display showing drone positions, target location, and pre-programmed flight paths. The technology enabling this operation was sophisticated in its coordination, but built from accessible components. Commercial flight control software had been modified to enable swarm behavior, allowing the drones to communicate with each other through encrypted radio signals and adjust their flight paths in real time based on the actions of their neighbors. This was not artificial intelligence in the traditional sense. No machine learning algorithms or neural networks. Instead, it was elegant programming that gave each drone simple rules. Maintain spacing from your neighbors, follow the general direction toward the target, and adjust speed to arrive simultaneously. The result was a swarm that behaved like a flock of starlings, moving as a coordinated unit while each individual drone followed basic instructions. The 50 drones lifted into the cold November air and immediately dispersed into 5 groups of 10, each taking slightly different routes toward the target. This was the first layer of the attack strategy, forcing the Russian radar systems to track not one cohesive formation, but multiple smaller groups, approaching from different vectors. Russian operators watching their screens saw the contacts appear at the edge of their radar range, initially dismissing them as civilian aircraft, or perhaps reconnaissance drones conducting surveillance. The Pantsir system's identification, friend or foe, interrogation, returned no military transponder signals, which matched the profile of commercial drones. Standard operating procedure called for monitoring such contacts, but not engaging unless they approached within 5 kilometers of protected assets. The Ukrainian operators had anticipated this response. Their drones maintained altitude and speed profiles that mimicked civilian recreational drones. Nothing in their flight characteristics suggested military intent. They flew at 80 meters altitude, well below the ceiling where military reconnaissance drones typically operated. Their speed held steady at 45 kilometers per hour, slower than attack drones, but consistent with hobbyist aircraft. To Russian radar operators, they appeared to be civilian drones that had wandered into restricted airspace, an annoyance requiring warning, but not immediate engagement. At 6:52, when the nearest group of drones crossed the 5-kilometer threshold, Russian operators escalated their alert status. The Pantsir system's radar locked onto the contacts, and its fire control computer began calculating engagement solutions. This was the moment the Ukrainian plan entered its critical phase. The system's targeting algorithm assessed the 10 drones approaching from the northwest and designated them as low-priority threats, based on their speed, size, and flight characteristics. Protocol required the system to track these contacts while maintaining readiness for higher priority threats. The cruise missiles, fighter bombers, or attack helicopters that represented genuine dangers. Meanwhile, the other 40 drones continued their approach from 4 different directions, now accelerating and losing altitude. The Ukrainian operators had programmed this phase carefully. As soon as the first group was detected and locked, all remaining drones increased speed to 70 kilometers per hour and dropped to 30 meters altitude. They spread out horizontally, maximizing the angular separation between different groups. Each drone began transmitting on slightly different radio frequencies, creating multiple distinct signatures for Russian electronic warfare systems to track. The Pantsir system's radar suddenly painted 49 targets. One drone from the original Northwest group had experienced a battery failure and crashed into a field, an acceptable loss in the Ukrainian plan. 49 drones approaching from 5 directions, each moving at combat speed toward a defended installation. The fire control computer's priority algorithm immediately recalculated. These were no longer recreational drones wandering off course. This was a coordinated attack. The system designated targets based on proximity and threat assessment, prioritizing the groups that would reach the installation first. The dual 30mm autocannons swiveled toward the northwest, tracking the lead group of drones now 3 kilometers away. At 6:54 and 18 seconds, the cannons opened fire, spitting 4,000 rounds per minute toward the small, fast-moving targets. The first drone exploded in midair, shredded by 20mm projectiles. 2 seconds later, the second drone disintegrated. The Russian system was performing exactly as designed, identifying threats, engaging with overwhelming firepower, destroying targets with mechanical precision. But while the cannons engaged the northwest group, 3 other groups of drones crossed the 2-kilometer threshold from the east, south, and southwest. The fire control computer recognized the tactical problem immediately. Multiple threat axes, insufficient engagement time. It made the logical decision, programmed into its targeting hierarchy: engage the closest threats first, then shift to secondary targets. The cannons continued firing at the northwest group, destroying the 3rd and 4th drones. Meanwhile, surface-to-air missiles launched from their tubes, streaking toward the southern approach, where 10 drones flew in loose formation. The missiles, each costing approximately $400,000, tracked their targets with active radar guidance, closing at supersonic speed. 2 drones exploded as missiles detonated within lethal radius. A 3rd missile missed when its target drone executed a pre-programmed evasive maneuver, a simple programmed role that changed its radar cross-section at the critical moment. The missile's proximity fuse failed to detonate, and the weapon streaked past its target, self-destructing 2 kilometers beyond. At 6:55, the tactical situation for Russian defenders deteriorated catastrophically. 23 drones remained operational and had crossed inside 1-kilometer radius, too close for effective missile engagement, too numerous for cannon systems to engage sequentially. The Ukrainian operators watched their tablet screens as icons swarmed toward the target marker, their programmed terminal phase activating. Each remaining drone accelerated to maximum speed, diving toward the Pantsir installation from multiple vectors simultaneously. The fire control system attempted to prioritize targets, but faced a mathematically impossible problem. It could track all 23 drones, calculate firing solutions for all 23 drones, but it could only engage one target at a time with its cannon systems. The fundamental limitation was not computational power or sensor capability. It was physics. The cannons could traverse at 60 degrees per second, but switching between targets separated by 90 degrees of azimuth required 1.5 seconds. In that 1.5 seconds, a drone traveling at maximum speed covered 37 meters. With targets approaching from multiple directions simultaneously, the system could destroy perhaps 5 or 6 drones before the remainder reached their impact points. The artificial intelligence controlling the Pantsir system continued executing its programming flawlessly, engaging targets in optimal sequence, firing with perfect accuracy, and failing because perfection was inadequate against overwhelming numbers. The first Ukrainian drone struck the Pantsir's radar array at 6:55 and 34 seconds. The 1-kilogram shaped charge detonated on impact, punching through the radar, antennas, protective housing, and destroying delicate transmitter components. The radar display in the Russian command bunker went dark instantly. The system was not destroyed, but its primary sensor was offline. Blind, the Pantsir could no longer detect incoming threats. 2 seconds later, 3 more drones impacted the installation's support vehicles. The command truck, generator trailer, and missile reload vehicle. None of these strikes caused catastrophic damage, but each one inflicted enough harm to render systems inoperable. The command truck's communications array sparked and died as its antenna mount shattered. The generator trailer's fuel line ruptured, leaking diesel across concrete as electrical systems failed. The missile reload vehicle's hydraulic crane bent at an impossible angle, its loading mechanism destroyed. More drones crashed into the Pantsir platform itself, warheads detonating against the launcher's base, cannon mounts, and fire control systems. By 6:56, 14 Ukrainian drones had struck their targets. 9 more drones circled overhead, their onboard cameras transmitting damage assessment imagery back to operators 80 kilometers away. The remaining 9 drones did not continue attacking. Their mission programming included a crucial final phase, documentation and verification. Ukrainian operators reviewed the camera feeds, confirming that the Pantsir radar was destroyed, the command systems were offline, and the installation was effectively neutralized. Satisfied with the battle damage assessment, they executed the extraction protocol. The 9 surviving drones climbed to 200 meters altitude and began their return journey, following pre-programmed routes that would bring them to recovery points where Ukrainian forces could retrieve them for maintenance and reuse. 5 of these 9 drones successfully returned to Ukrainian-controlled territory. 3 experienced battery failures during the return flight and crashed in territory between front lines. One was intercepted by Russian electronic warfare systems that jammed its control signal, causing it to execute its fail-safe programming and self-destruct. Still, recovering 5 drones meant Ukrainian forces could refurbish and redeploy them in future operations, further reducing the already minimal cost of the attack. Inside the Russian command bunker, 27 operators stared at dead screens and useless equipment. The $50 million air defense system they had been operating 10 minutes earlier was now an immobile collection of damaged electronics and bent metal. The installation's communications were destroyed, preventing them from requesting immediate support or reporting the attack to higher command. Their radar was offline, meaning they could not detect additional threats, even if they materialized. The missile launchers remained physically intact, but without radar guidance and fire control systems, they were expensive sculptures rather than functional weapons. The operators could not even evacuate. Their armored vehicles were parked beside the installation and had been damaged by drone strikes, rendering them inoperable. They were trapped in their bunker, defending nothing, with no means of communication and no certainty that rescue would arrive before Ukrainian ground forces decided to exploit the newly created gap in Russian air defenses. The Ukrainian operation had achieved its objectives with brutal efficiency. For an investment of $15,000 in drones, plus the cost of explosives, control systems, and operator training, perhaps $30,000 total, they had neutralized a $50 million air defense installation. The mathematical ratio was staggering. $1 spent eliminated $1,667 of enemy capability, but the strategic implications extended far beyond financial calculations. Every military force operating modern air defense systems suddenly confronted an uncomfortable reality. Expensive, sophisticated technology designed to counter expensive, sophisticated threats was vulnerable to cheap, numerous attacks that cost less than the fuel needed to deploy the defending systems. The Pantsir-S1 had performed flawlessly within its design parameters, engaging targets with textbook precision, following doctrine exactly as programmed. Its failure was not technological inadequacy, but conceptual obsolescence. It had been built to fight the previous war, where aerial threats were costly precision weapons deployed sparingly. It could not adapt to a battlefield where threats were disposable commodities deployed in overwhelming quantities. The operation's success rippled through military planning departments worldwide. Within 72 hours, defense analysts at the Pentagon, headquarters in Brussels, and military institutes in Beijing were studying detailed breakdowns of the engagement, trying to understand its tactical and strategic implications. The fundamental question they grappled with was not how Ukraine had executed this specific attack. The technical details were relatively straightforward once you understood the basic concept. The disturbing question was what this meant for the future of military technology and defense spending. If a $30,000 operation could neutralize $50 million of equipment, what did that imply about the multi-billion-dollar air defense networks protecting critical infrastructure worldwide? Could air bases, naval installations, command centers, and logistics hubs defend themselves against swarm attacks without fundamentally redesigning their defensive architectures? The traditional military-industrial approach of building increasingly expensive, capable systems to counter increasingly sophisticated threats suddenly seemed vulnerable to a doctrine that substituted quantity for quality and accepted high attrition rates as an acceptable cost of overwhelming defensive capabilities. Russian military leadership struggled to develop countermeasures. The obvious response, deploying more air defense systems to provide overlapping coverage, multiplied costs without solving the underlying vulnerability. If one Pantsir-S1 costing $50 million could be neutralized by $30,000 worth of drones, deploying 3 Pantsir systems to provide redundant coverage still meant attackers could neutralize all 3 for $90,000, less than the cost of a single air-to-ground missile. Alternative approaches proved equally problematic. Electronic warfare systems could jam drone control signals, but Ukrainian drones operated on civilian frequency bands that were difficult to jam without also disrupting friendly communications. More concerning, Ukrainian engineers were already adapting their drones to operate autonomously during terminal attack phases, removing the need for constant control signals that could be jammed. Once a drone swarm crossed a predetermined threshold distance from its target, each drone switched to autonomous navigation using satellite positioning and optical sensors, making electronic warfare countermeasures ineffective during the critical final approach. The psychological impact on Russian troops operating air defense systems proved as significant as the tactical implications. Soldiers who had trained on Pantsir systems had been taught they were operating the cutting edge of defensive technology, weapons platforms capable of protecting infrastructure from advanced aerial threats. Discovering that their multi-million-dollar systems could be overwhelmed by garage-built drones, costing less than a monthly salary, created a crisis of confidence. If cheap Ukrainian drones could penetrate their defenses, what would happen when those defenses faced American stealth bombers, British cruise missiles, or French fighters equipped with electronic warfare suites? The doctrine that expensive, capable systems provided security began to collapse, replaced by uncertainty about whether any fixed defensive installation could survive in an environment where attackers could afford to expend enormous numbers of cheap weapons in saturation attacks. Ukrainian forces leveraged this psychological advantage aggressively. Following the November 3rd operation, they conducted similar drone swarm attacks against Russian air defense installations throughout occupied territories. Not every attack succeeded. Russian forces adapted their tactics, implementing lessons learned from the initial engagement. Some installations deployed radar-guided anti-aircraft guns, optimized for engaging multiple small targets simultaneously. Others positioned electronic warfare systems to jam control signals before drones reached terminal attack range. A few installations succeeded in developing rapid response protocols where operators manually guided short-range missiles using optical tracking, bypassing radar, systems that struggled to prioritize multiple small targets. But even when Russian defenses successfully repelled drone swarm attacks, they expended expensive missiles and ammunition engaging cheap, disposable threats, achieving victories that drained resources without inflicting meaningful attrition on Ukrainian capabilities. The broader strategic lesson from the November 3rd operation extended beyond air defense vulnerabilities. It demonstrated a fundamental shift in how military power could be projected and contested. For decades, advanced militaries had operated under the assumption that technological superiority provided decisive advantages. Better sensors, faster processors, more precise weapons, and more sophisticated platforms would overwhelm adversaries with inferior equipment. This assumption held true when both sides fielded expensive, limited-quantity systems. But when one side embraced mass production of cheap, expendable weapons and accepted high attrition as an inherent cost of operations, the calculus changed dramatically. Superior technology no longer guaranteed victory if it could be overwhelmed by sufficient numbers of inferior systems operating collectively. The November 3rd operation crystallized this reality into undeniable proof that changed how military professionals worldwide thought about the future of warfare. 3 Ukrainian operators controlling 50 drones had successfully destroyed a $50 million air defense system in under 2 minutes. The November 3rd drone swarm operation marked a turning point in modern warfare. What happened that morning outside Mariupol was not just a tactical victory for Ukraine, it was proof that the rules of military engagement had fundamentally changed. Expensive technology, decades of engineering, and billions in defense spending could be neutralized by clever tactics, cheap components, and operators willing to accept that some battles are won not through superiority, but through overwhelming numbers and innovative thinking that challenges every assumption about how wars should be fought. If this tactical breakdown showed you something you did not know about modern warfare, hit that like button. We decode military operations that mainstream media misses, breaking down the strategies and technologies, reshaping combat in real time. Subscribe to Combat Decoded for more in-depth analysis of drone warfare, asymmetric tactics, and the operations changing how militaries fight. New videos every week. Turn on notifications so you never miss an operation breakdown.